Um, well, to begin with, we'd like to express our appreciation to the Jewish Family Services of Western Mass for recognizing the need to give this extra attention to the resettlement of the newly arrived Afghans and for organizing this series of presentations. This is indeed our final one in a series of 7, I believe. And we really appreciate you taking the time, setting aside the time. Hope you find it worth your while. Our approach in this presentation is to talk about Afghanistan, the country, geography, the ethnicities, religions in a general way, as well as family structures, gender dynamics, basic health and hygiene practices, and to focus on the cultural health-related issues. Our presentation is about 40 minutes, we think, and of course, you're welcome to put your comments or questions in the chat, and we will open up for discussion. We'll have plenty of time at the end. So we apologize for offering such a general introduction because there are so many languages and cultures and religious practices, ethnicities, tribal structures, educational differences, social and economic classes in Afghanistan. And it's hard to give an introduction, of course, without generalizing, though not everything we say will apply to all. And of course, each individual's experience of being an Afghan is unique. I'm going to pass it over to Zala to introduce herself first.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you so much for your time. I hope everyone is hearing well. I'm sitting outside. Because I just finished office and work. So yeah, thank you so much for your time to learn about the culture and some of the realities in Afghanistan when it comes to the health. So as it helps better resolve, I would say, the problems that Afghans might face, or vice versa, while Americans or the medical staff deal with Afghans. And we would be happy to share our experience. And I'm an Afghan, and also I'm an American. I lived for the last 12 years in US. But I have worked in Afghanistan for over, I would say, like a decade, on more than 10 years on international development with focus on women economic development and girls education. I have a master's degree in international economics and finance as a Fulbright scholar, and the most relevant experience that I have is not only that I'm Afghan and I have worked in development and I have been dealing with Afghans both in rural and urban settings in Afghanistan, but also I worked for 2 months at the base in Fort Dix, New Jersey, where I really firsthand saw the the recent evacuees and their issues and problems, and also and I was for a month at the clinic as well. So I would love to hear more from you and anything that we can help with to sharing our experience. And yeah, thank you so much.
And so I always like to add, because Zala forgets to say, that we've worked together on research projects on women and authority and legitimacy, many issues through the University of Colorado Boulder. So we're part of that team at the geography department there. And that as well, that Zala is running a social enterprise in Afghanistan that is called Safe Path Prosperity, that creates menstrual hygiene, I'm going to get it wrong, menstrual hygiene management products that are safe, reusable, renewable pads created in Afghanistan. And that's a first, and it's really remarkable. So there may be questions about that afterwards. My name is Rachel Lair. My career has been formulated by Afghanistan and its surroundings. I took up Persian, the dialects of which are spoken in Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan as an undergraduate in college because it fit in my schedule and I didn't even know where it was spoken, and it's taken me on this interesting ride for sure. I went on to pursue my PhD in linguistics and languages and at University of Chicago, and continue to pursue Persian basically as my main language, although in the end I did a dissertation on a minority language called Pashai in Eastern Afghanistan. So I've spent a great deal of time in the rural parts of Eastern Afghanistan with the community that I wrote my dissertation through, and also started an NGO in Afghanistan for that community, with that community, for the women to earn income through their refined handwork. During the mid 2000s, the civilian surge period, I trained State Department and USAID and military personnel before their deployments in Afghan culture. So I've had my hands in a lot of different pies in Afghanistan, and I've made every mistake that's possible to make in Afghanistan, insulting people and inadvertently and whatnot. And people were always kind enough to guide me in the right direction. And I feel like I've been very lucky for that. And I really appreciate how gracious the Afghans are. So we're going to take you through our images and our presentation, and then we'll just have open for discussion. I just have to have a caveat here. I have a very bossy little dog right next to me. I'm just going to send her upstairs, or it's going to be a little bit of a nightmare here. So I'm just going to move to the next slide, which hopefully you can ponder. Oops, let's try to do that again. There, and I'll be right down. Go, come on, upstairs, hurry, hurry, move, come on, upstairs. If it's not one thing, it's another. I apologize. So Afghanistan is a country, as you can see, that sits at the crossroads of major ancient cultures between East and West, at the heart of the old Silk Road. And its location is more defined by where it is not than where it is. It's not the Middle East. It's not Central Asia. It's not South Asia. It's bits and pieces of some of those things. Population of Afghanistan is 37.5 million, and the Kabul, the capital city, is 4.5 million. It's a landlocked country. There isn't much water. All the rivers run through Afghanistan, and the Hindu Kush Mountains kind of divide it from northeast to southwest. And the southern area is desert and the northern area is steppe. Many of the recent arrivals are from the southeastern part of the country. Afghanistan continues to confound its invaders, its occupiers, its guests. It is the home of Rumi, the poet, the game of polo and backgammon, and it's often described as rough and rugged and unconquerable. And as you can see, it's also breathtakingly beautiful. Cultures of Afghanistan have been influenced over the years by Buddhist monks who traveled through from the east, the raiding hordes of Turkic tribes from the north, and the indigenous Indo-Europeans and Indo-Aryan cultures, and of course Islam, which profoundly and repeatedly continued to transform Afghanistan. The climate is arid, rarely below 20 degrees. In the summer, it can be hot and humid in the east, while dry in Kabul because of the altitude of nearly 6,000 feet. Afghanistan's population is more than 70% rural, and most of the people are subsistence farmers. Drought has been a persistent problem for years, and there's far more arable land than there's water to cultivate. So water rights and land ownership are continuous sources of tension and conflict. Child labor is common. In urban areas, children mainly work in the mechanic shops and in the rug industry and in convenience stores. In the rural areas, they do agricultural work. In general, children are tasked with many responsibilities at a young age. Even if they are not working, they are looking after younger siblings, preparing food, gathering fuel, shopping, and running errands, for example. Families tend to be large. 6 to 10 children is common. In large families, little individual attention is given to children. Often they are allowed to be outside, unsupervised all day in Afghanistan, and much the same here. Afghan parents are not typically involved in their children's education, although teachers are held in high regard. So corporal punishment is still used at home and in school in Afghanistan. Typically, in Afghan households, there's no bedtime. Children often go to sleep with their parents, and co-sleeping is the norm. And there's no culture of reading. The children, often iPads and phones are handed over for hours on end. So keeping track of children's records, such as immunizations or school reports, is also not followed carefully. Dental problems are rampant. Dental hygiene is not maintained. Sweets are a staple of the Afghan diet, and little attention is given to nutrition. Elevated blood lead has been detected in a majority of the recently arrived children, according to studies that I was looking at. But let me back up a little bit and tell you something about the history of Afghanistan. Afghanistan was never colonized by the British, though 3 wars were fought over their attempts, and this continues to be a point of pride among Afghans. Afghanistan's borders were determined during the late 19th century, where Russian and British colonial powers, vying for territory, influence, wealth, and resources, battled what was known as the Great Game. Afghanistan was conquered by neither, but had its borders defined as a buffer zone between the 2 imperial powers. Political conflict in the 1970s led to the Soviet invasion in 1979, which drove over 3 million Afghan refugees into Pakistan and gave rise to numerous Mujahideen factions bolstered in Pakistan and funded by the US. The US proxy war ended with the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, and the US interest in Afghanistan evaporated along with it. A civil war raged among the Mujahideen factions until 1996, when the Taliban movement rose in response. Their Islamic emirate came out of the Islamic schools, educating Afghans, Afghan boys or orphans in Pakistan. They put an end to the civil war, but created a pariah state, plunging the country deeper into poverty and isolation. This ostensibly ended with the US invasion in October 2001. So trauma has been a big part of all Afghans' lives. The country has been in conflict for 45 years, and the impacts are present in all aspects of life, from loss of relatives to continuous displacement to disrupted social structures to executive function. It goes without saying, 45 years of war, broken promises, weak government, untrustworthy authorities have taken a toll. Trauma contributes to so many of the personal and social problems Afghans experience. The demands of a strange culture, homesickness, displacement, anxieties about the future, separation from family all weigh heavily. While they are physically distant from their homes and relatives, they are in constant contact with them. Some, by virtue of being here, have put their relatives back home at risk. So, and many people of these Afghans who recently have arrived feel deeply in debt. And that's hard for them because receiving charity can be seen as a sign of weakness. Most were self-sufficient at home, and some are highly educated and worked in positions of respect and authority. Much of that is gone here in the American context, or rather, it's invisible to us, though not within their communities. But we'll talk later a little bit more about stress and trauma. Now, my favorite topic, briefly, languages. Afghanistan is made up of numerous ethnicities, languages, and tribal and non-tribally organized groups. The languages of Afghanistan have roots in the Indo-European languages families, in the Turkic family of languages, and in Indo-Aryan languages. So if you do nothing but just look at the colors, it gives you an idea of how the swaths of languages spoken in Afghanistan. And these are just the major groups you see here. There's really over 30 languages spoken in Afghanistan. None of them are genetically related to Arabic, which is a Semitic language. And though much of the vocabulary in the Afghan languages comes from Arabic, they share a modified form of the script, they are not actually related languages. So the dominant political group are the Pashtuns, and you see that in gray on the map, green on the map. And as you've heard, probably the Taliban are predominantly Pashtun, but so have been all the monarchs and the presidents. Pashtuns are Sunni Muslim, and they are found all over Afghanistan, and also, as you can see, in a large part of Pakistan across the border. Many of the Pashtuns also speak Dari. So the next population size is the Dari speaking group, which you find in the purples and blues, more or less, here on the map. And this is language close to Iranian Farsi or Afghan or Tajikistan Tajik. And they also live throughout Afghanistan and for the most part are Sunni Muslim. Now that central purple area you see is the Hazara. They make up about 9% of the population and they speak a dialect of Dari as well. They've been seen as the most marginalized group politically and socially, and they mostly practice Shia Islam. And because of that, they have been persecuted by Pashtun governments, warlords, and most recently under the Taliban with mass genocides. Many fled to Iran in the past 40 years. There, of course, in the north are Uzbeks and Turkmen and Kyrgyz and other languages and families of languages spoken. And over the years, many of the rival groups have competed. And so there's tends to be a loyalty to kin and ethnicity. It's also the case that prejudices and rivalries between families, tribes, and ethnicities are not left behind in Afghanistan, and they bring them with them into the diaspora. So one of the chief issues that comes up in medical issues for the Afghans is the use of medical interpreters. The official languages of Afghanistan are Dari and Pashto. Those are the official languages as opposed to the national languages of which there are many. What is spoken in Afghanistan is Dari. It's not Farsi. Farsi is the language that's spoken in Iran. And if you're looking for Farsi interpreters, you will get Iranians, not Afghans, possibly. And Dari and Farsi are formally very close. They're similar, but the spoken languages are not. There are differences in pronunciation, in some of the verb forms, and in the vocabulary. And intelligibility depends on where the speakers are from and what their education level is. So many of the Afghan evacuees here actually do not understand Farsi. Problematic dynamics between Farsi-speaking Iranians and Dari-speaking Afghans have historical roots exacerbated by the influx of Afghan refugees to Iran during the past 40 years. So it's always best to ask a client whether a Farsi-speaking interpreter will work, and would they feel more comfortable with a male or a female interpreter. Some have complained that Farsi speakers look down on them or are sometimes rude to them. And Afghans may be concerned about being judged by other Afghans as well. There's no perfect solution here. So, or they might not trust Afghans from different ethnicities. So we shouldn't assume that any other Afghan would be a good interpreter either. Many prefer to bring their own relatives or friends to interpret if they need that. Same problem with Pashto. Pakistani, if you're looking for a Pashto interpreter, you may find that you get a Pakistani Pashto interpreter. But Pashto has two major dialects in Afghanistan, and the Pakistani Pashto is not the same. Well, one thing is universal in Afghanistan is the greeting. It's a pan-Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. And the response is very simple. You take the two words and switch them, wa alaikum assalam, and upon you peace. And for all speakers, this is a universal greeting. And Afghans would very much appreciate your using some of these phrases. And it's really used throughout the Islamic world. So you get a lot of mileage from it. Afghan society is steeped in Islam, and it is a central organizing principle in most Afghans' lives. The one thing that is common to all Afghans is their commitment to Islam as both a belief system and as a social program. The idea being that a unity of belief is linked to collective well-being, resulting in social order. Islam brings a strong sense of morality. Sunni Muslims make up about 90% of the Afghan population, Shia Muslims about 10%. But both Sunni and Shia follow the religious texts of the Quran and the Hadith, that is the words and the actions of the Prophet, and the 5 pillars of Islam: prayer, charity, fasting for the month of Ramadan, Hajj, that is the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the declaration of the Shahada, the profession of faith. The virgin birth of Jesus is upheld in Islam as well, and Jesus is considered the penultimate prophet in Islam. And Mary is also, Maryam is quite revered. So Islam pervades all aspects of life. And some people pray multiple times a day, some people don't, it's their choice, but clothing is often Islamically informed, meant to be loose and modest in general. And it also, Islam informs what is halal, that which is permissible, and what is haram, which is not permissible. Some things that it tells you is who your marriage partners can be and what kind of foods you can eat. And things that are haram or not permissible would include pork or alcohol. And many other aspects, social interactions, life cycle rituals are dictated by Islam. So Afghans have expressed concern that because they are Muslims and refugees, they're not sure that medical practitioners have their best interest in mind. They are also quite concerned that there might be some non-permissible, say, haram ingredient in medicine. In fact, many Afghans get their medicines brought from Afghanistan or Pakistan or sent from India, if possible, where the regulations are much weaker, and because they trust those medications more. People often don't eat vitamins that they might be prescribed or given because they're concerned that the jelly might be made from some pork product. So those are some concerns that have come to us. Some people are concerned that the hospital food is not halal and they'll bring their own food to the hospital. Some people fast during the month of Ramadan against medical advice, such as pregnant people and those with diabetes or other issues. And even though Islam prohibits people who are not fit to fast, since it is a social convention in Afghanistan, people will still fast, even to their detriment. This is a time when people might refuse medical tests or blood draws. Others are concerned about surgery, in particular anesthesia. They have expressed to us that they're not sure what shameful thing might be done to them when they're unconscious. And some people will hide their illnesses because of this. There are two major Eid celebrations that we have just had, Eid al-Qurban, and Eid celebrations are, celebrated. Eid holidays are celebrated by people visiting with their friends and family, sharing food and gifts, especially for children. Birthday celebrations are not customary. Till recently, and still in many cases, births were not recorded officially. Afghans often estimate their age and choose their own birth dates. And this could have repercussions for age-related milestones or medical screening. Afghans have a particular particular kind of folk medicine that they subscribe to. That's called what they call Greek medicine. And when there's no clear cause for an illness or nothing to attribute it to, then it may be the result of the evil eye, purposeful or inadvertent, and it can be banished by recitation of Quran verses or burning of esfand, which is called wild rue. And so the smoke is meant to purify. Mental illness events are often attributed to the evil eye. Other illnesses might be ascribed to an imbalance of hot and cold attributes. So if the illness is attributed to hot, then the treatment might be cold and vice versa. So people, diseases, and foods tend to be divided into hot and cold. Rich foods are hot and less rich foods are cold. Black tea is hot, green tea is cold. Children who are considered very hot are believed to get sore throats or coughs in summer, which is hot, from eating greasy, hot food. Thus, in summer, sore throats should be treated often by avoiding those kinds of things. So this is a system that you may or may not encounter and really is quite pervasive in Afghanistan and among the Afghans. Afghan communities, the villages and the rural regions, tend to be self-governing. There has never been much reach of the government into the rural regions, and so the government is seen as corrupt, rapacious, unreliable, and unavailable. Suspicion runs high of government officials and representation, and therefore Afghans prefer to avoid authorities and manage their affairs themselves. This often extends to medical personnel and Western medicine structures and practices as well. So developing trust and positive relationships to government representatives and all kinds of figures of authority will take time. There are numerous structural differences between the way medicine is practiced in Afghanistan and here. There's pretty much no preventive medicine in Afghanistan. Medicine is problem-oriented. If you are in pain or distress, you go to a doctor or a clinic, you are seen without an appointment and usually given medicine and at least vitamins, and records are not kept. So since medicine is often sought on an emergency basis, the expectation is that treatment also be dispensed immediately and quickly. Our system of PCPs and testing and specialists is unfamiliar and does not make sense in their context. They often or sometimes conclude that the clinicians here are less experienced with their problems because they feel that this extensive testing might be unnecessary and that the clinician is not knowledgeable enough, and that's why all the testing. So Afghans for sure need to be oriented and taken to meet their primary providers if it's possible, so that they know that they can see their practitioners on a regular basis rather than rushing to the emergency room all the time. Many don't know how to work with insurance and what it means to have a family practitioner. So they use the ER or urgent care when they have an issue. And without an understanding of or familiarity with the notion of preventive care, they continue to use emergency services. Many don't understand why they should complete their medication once they feel better or make follow-up visits. It's not part of the way medicine is dispensed in Afghanistan. So we understand that they are mailed a notebook with lists of clinics, and they have to select their clinic and then call their insurance so that they're registered with that clinic. And this may be insurmountable for some. Sometimes they get bills from the emergency room and they get very stressed and are not sure how. Those are just could be overwhelming issues for some. Even for some, picking up medication from the pharmacy could be challenging and they may not understand the instructions. Follow-up test compliance is difficult because most require online applications to be filled out. And that might be too hard for some to do. So for example, someone may go for a second or third visit and the practitioner is frustrated when they haven't done the prerequisite tests, such as blood work, and they come back with the same complaints. Many don't trust the medicine here. They say that it's not very strong. We hear complaints that the sleeping medication here doesn't have a good effect, while the ones in Afghanistan were better. Many Afghans who've been treated in Afghanistan have a high tolerance for pain medication, and the medications they prescribe back home are very high doses that are meant to treat the symptoms and not the cause. Thus, when they are given medicine here, often it is weaker, has a weaker effect, and it just builds distrust in the Western medical system. So the biggest concerns are access to and communication. And we've been told that the most prevalent issues that Afghans who are dealing with chronic illnesses is that they don't attend their multiple appointments and they have trouble following up with scheduling and things like that. And the language barrier, yet again, can be very problematic for some. And so yet again, people run off to the ER. I'm going to talk a bit about family structure. Family structure is traditional patriarchal, where most decisions are taken by the father or husband. With respect to the family structure, the core notion is public versus private. Family matters are part of the private sphere, and private sphere is both physical and social. Women wield authority over other women, and children and daughters are tasked with most of the housework. Boys are freer to leave the house, pursue their goals, and in general, interact in the public sphere. Parents make important life decisions for their children in many cases, such as the professions that they're going to pursue, their education, or marriage. First cousin marriage is prevalent, accounting for nearly half of all marriages. Men decide their wives, sisters, and daughters' access to mobility, to education, employment, socialization, etc. So education, as well as gender segregated, and socialization outside the immediate family tends to be gender segregated as well. Men socialize with men and women with women. Far fewer girls complete schooling than boys, and girls and women may be reluctant even to speak in front of boys or men. And due to concerns about honor and propriety, girls may have less socialization with their peers. There will probably be no sleepovers or after-school activities or dating. Women's sphere is in the home. That's where they have control over the domestic space decision-making. They're in charge of the domestic chores, the cooking, the cleaning, the raising children, and preparing food for the guests. A large family, childcare is passed down the line to older children. And so attention to children's education and the external social needs of children do not fall into the domestic sphere. So it's not the mother's job to take care of those things for their children. And as you can see from these images, the conditions differ greatly between urban and rural settings in Afghanistan, although many of the Afghans who have come recently are from rural backgrounds. Although much of the housework still falls on the girls, there's less manual labor and girls have more opportunities in the city to attend school. And certainly matriarchs exercise decision-making powers, and depending on the household dynamics, it could be more or less extensive, weighing in on marriage arrangements, household spending, education of daughters, and more. And of course, much of this has been in flux, especially in the last 20 years, where women have had more opportunity to come outside of their homes and pursue jobs and education and things like that. Nevertheless, it's still, there's many households, women are expected to stay home. And even in the US and other diasporas, it may take longer for women in resettlement because they have to learn the local language, because they may or may not have an opportunity to work. It could be years before they learn how to drive. Many women suffer from the pressures of managing a large household and the lack of mobility and choices in life. And it could sometimes be more isolating in the diaspora if their fathers or husbands are particularly conservative and restrict their mobility even further. On the other hand, others may have access to improved conditions with improved mobility and more classes and find themselves thwarted by economic difficulties and lack of family support. So it runs the gamut. Public sphere is where men dominate. So men's role is chiefly outside the home in the public, and they are responsible for the family's economic well-being, as well as the preservation of family honor, particularly as it concerns the behavior of women around dress, social interaction, education, work, and public presence. It can be seen as a loss of honor for the father, the brother, or the husband if a woman does not comply with these expectations. And this can be a source of mental distress for both parties and lead to violence at times. Men can pose barriers for women in numerous ways. They have always made health decisions for their wives and can continue to do so here, especially when the wives don't know the language and are not literate. Much social behavior is influenced by Afghans' awareness of their personal and family honor. So honor refers to a person's reputation, their prestige, their value, and it is how they are perceived by their community. Most Afghans consider a person's behavior to be reflective of the family. Thus, when a person's behavior is perceived to be dishonorable, their family shares the shame. And if it occurs in the wider sphere, then it might implicate the ethnic group or the tribe or even the religion. So preservation of honor and community opinion is often at the forefront of people's minds. And this cannot be overstated. It influences people to behave conservatively in accordance with social expectations, to avoid drawing attention to themselves or risk doing something perceived to be dishonorable. It puts a great deal of pressure on people, especially youth growing up here, to maintain strict social boundaries. Understanding of medical conditions or how the body works, that is general health literacy, is low in Afghanistan. Taboo topics include menstrual preparedness and hygiene, intimacy, etc. We urge you to be curious about what people do know and what they want to know and engage them in decision-making. Be curious. Employ cultural humility by learning about them, from them, and centering their culture in the conversation. As patient, ask patients how they would like to receive information. There's a wide range of education among the evacuees. Some are highly educated, while many are non-literate. Overall literacy in Afghanistan is under 40%, 3 times higher for men than women. So since many cannot read in Afghanistan, medical practitioners use pictures, or they write a code on medicines that indicate how many times a day and how many pills and things like that. So it really would help to verify an understanding by having patients explain back to them how they will follow directions that they are given. And because medical care is so different here from what they're accustomed to, it can be a challenge to explain. And it's an opportunity to educate, of course, the differences in policies, especially when it comes to prescribing less medication than back in Afghanistan. It may help to explain that medicine is regulated more strictly here, that we don't think that there will be a problem with them understanding the fact that things are different here, of course. The problem will come from their frustration when they have no choice but to accept that they will not be given the level of relief, pain relief that they have found back home. You may also explain about opioid addiction and building tolerance to help them understand why these rules are in place to begin with. And pointing out the side effects of taking a lot of medication can be used as a convincing logic. It might take a while for people to understand because that they are dependent on medication. In Afghanistan, there's the belief that the doctor who prescribes more medicine is a more qualified and caring one. So we suggest that providers be open and honest and using an appropriate interpreter to explain that they only want to help. And although it may take trial and error to find the source of the problem, they should be patient. Many Afghans expect to come to the practitioner and for them to just make their pain go away. The procedure of pathology can be explained and how diseases and illnesses are treated at the root cause instead of giving strong medication to mask the symptoms. They may come to understand that when they stop taking the medicine, the pain returns. Most patients will be familiar with the feeling of masking symptoms, and they may be more receptive to what the provider has to say. Recent research identifying health concerns have included pregnancy and prenatal and newborn care, diabetes and other non-communicable chronic diseases, dental disease, traumatic injuries in various stages of treatment and healing, respiratory infections, skin infections like scabies, gastrointestinal infections, chronic malnutrition, and stress. Infections endemic to Afghanistan also include malaria and cutaneous leishmaniasis. Healthy eating, mindfulness, exercise are new notions. Men and women experience high blood pressure and cholesterol due to the sedentary lifestyles, the heavy salt and oil and meat in their diets, and many men are smokers. So people don't take these issues as seriously as we would like them to. In general, in conservative Afghan society, women and girls' mobility and autonomy has been limited, and literacy rates for women hover around 17%, and as few as 16% work outside the home, which is mostly applicable to urban educated women. Women in general are meant to be seen are meant not to be seen by women outside the family. Sorry, let me get that sentence straight. Women are not meant to be seen by men outside the family, and men, as the gatekeepers for women, are the gatekeepers for women and girls' lives. Therefore, access to medical treatment is often controlled by husbands or brothers or fathers. Afghan women are typically accompanied by a mahram or a male escort, and that is why women seeking medical treatment rarely come alone. And you may find, that they're reluctant to speak in front of the men as well. In fact, in Afghanistan, it's often the men who go to the medical practitioner on behalf of the women, especially in the rural regions, explain the problem, and then come back with the medication. Here, there are many who won't even let their 6 or 7-year-old daughters be seen by a male medical practitioner. Therefore, lack of access to language, literacy, autonomy, and public sphere experience, and the burden of large families puts women at particular risk. Women in Afghanistan have some of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, and some of the lowest prevalence of contraceptive use. So much of women's health needs to be mitigated through husbands who speak English and make it hard for women to make autonomous decisions. Women may ask about birth control in safe and private settings, but men are often opposed. Many consider babies, men and women, I should say, consider babies to be a gift from God, and birth control they may consider to be non-Islamic. Having lots of sons is a high status, and Afghan women are often valued by the number of sons they produce. Afghan families are quite large, particularly the rural ones with 6 to 10 children. While many circumstances and conditions contribute to mental health outcomes, the lack of awareness of treatment is one of the biggest barriers. Afghans very rarely talk about the stress they encounter on a day-to-day basis. Mental health is not mainstream in Afghanistan and is stigmatized in most cases. Even with simple things such as dealing with stress, it's overlooked and ignored. This builds up tension and anger, which they direct towards their families and their children. They're not aware that in most cases, not willing to learn about health coping mechanisms that would allow them to channel their stress and emotions is a healthy approach. For many, it's just the way things are, the way things have always been. That being said, we have been told that Afghan men and women take some time to themselves to wind down, and that is when the men get together to talk and eat, have tea, play cards, or women gather to drink tea and gossip. And both of these activities have been known to put them in better moods. So we've been told. Many have described their stress or trauma in terms of bodily pain, such as backaches and headaches. These may be core symptoms of depression. Recent research generally finds that Afghans show a relatively high level of psychological disorders and that they also experience high rates of discrimination when they reach the United States, all of which exacerbate the health impacts of stressors during refugee immigration. Several studies have shown that post-migration stress threatens the mental health of refugees and impedes their assimilation and success. Stress related to acculturation, lack of social support may manifest itself in various forms of distress in both the children and adults. And so the impact of these experiences is very important to understand in the case of these newly or somewhat still arriving Afghans, and to underscore the need during the resettlement period to provide culturally sensitive mental and emotional support. A particularly effective way of providing mental health services may be through educational settings. So in schools where people have a fairly high trust in school systems, that might be a good place for them to experience, for immigrant children to experience mental health services, and also combining mental health services with primary care. Certainly, there's a lot of training programs and awareness programs for staff in primary care that are seeing refugee patients. And I'm going to go over some of the resources at the end. Domestic violence. A recent UNICEF report indicates around 90% of Afghan women believe that it is the right of their husband to hit them or punish them if they do something wrong, especially with respect to childcare, household chores, or not asking for permission from their husband to meet people or wear a certain type of dress or even go shopping or on visits. So that's why for many of them, they don't see this as abuse. Rather, they see it as the right of their husband. It's widespread and it's widely accepted. The universal signs of domestic abuse are well known. Even if these women were being domestically abused, most will never speak up because they feel that if their husbands were to go to prison or if they were separated, the struggle of providing for their families and being independent in the US is not something that they can do. Communication strategies differ between Afghans and Americans. In the US, we rely on explicit forms of communication, the things that need to be said, less on implication. Our style is direct. We are not as good at reading nonverbal expressions. So our mode of communication is considered low context. We expect the speaker to fill in the context. By contrast, in Afghanistan, the mode of communication is high context. Meaning is embedded in sociocultural context, and much is communicated implicitly. The focus is on what is understood and not on what is said. So the style is quite indirect. People use analogies or stories or implication to communicate. This connects with notions of honor, where preserving your interlocutor's honor would require you to not say things directly. So Afghans may find it hard to ask for assistance, especially in front of others, because it shows weakness. And this may include issues with interpreters if they feel unsupported. In the same way, if you ask someone directly, if they understand what you're saying, it might embarrass them, and chances are they'll say yes. So you really need to triangulate around giving instructions and verifying in indirect ways, as I mentioned earlier. Time orientation could be quite different between people who have come from Afghanistan and those who have grown up here. So there's an expression that goes like, Americans have watches and Afghans have time. And this partly has to do with the different structures of our societies, where ours is a highly commodified, monetized, and punctuality really matters. It's not a shared notion in Afghanistan and is a challenge for many. Time is viewed much more flexibly. Making appointments, coming on time, coming early is not that important. Many think that if they come around the time that they're supposed to be seen, even if they're late, they expect to be seen, and they might get angry if they're asked to reschedule. Sometimes it's the logistics of transportation that makes medical visits challenging. A lack of attention to time-sensitive needs can make following treatment hard, even taking medicine on a schedule, for example. Often people are given just a few days of medicine in Afghanistan, not a 10 or 20-day regimen, and so they're not used to finishing a long regimen of medication. Gaining trust is a serious concern. In general, trust is something that can be built over time, and in Afghan communities, it is good to find influencers, elder community members, and convey a message through them. Even in a family, often there's an individual, age-wise, education-wise, length of stay in the US, for example, that can be trusted more for one who can share factors, and those people can really help bridge the gap. So obstacles to good care for Afghans here includes interpreters that may not always be speaking the language of the client. And there are many cultural issues with non-Afghan interpreters or those from different ethnicities. The lack of familiarity with the medical system is a barrier to good care, and just getting there, transportation is often an obstacle. So we, of course, recommend that you engage patients in decision-making, employ cultural humility by centering the culture of others and learning about them from them. And always engage, and always, of course, engage the patients in the processes of the decision-making. So I have some references to share. And Masara, you'll probably think of a way to put these up for people to have access to them. But the Brookings Institute has a nice brief from October 2021 on the challenge of addressing the healthcare needs of Afghan evacuees. The Center of Excellence in Newcomer Health Refugee Health Site contains education on various topics for new arrival health education. Resources are vetted and available in Dari, Farsi, and Pashto. There are webinars on various topics and trainings, free courses, clinical guidance, and they provide overviews for clinicians caring for new Afghan arrivals. University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine grand rounds when is that, in March? Yeah, in March was a presentation by two African-American women in the medical profession, and they share a study they have done on refugee health issues, women's issues in particular. It's quite informative. And additional cultural background is shared by the Afghan Health Initiative. The information is available in multiple Afghan languages, and also more information available in the Afghan Cultural Health Screening Consideration, so recorded webinars. So I have that's the newcomers. And EthnoMed has resources for integrating cultural information into clinical practice, and they provide information about cultural beliefs, medical issues, and other topics related to health care of immigrants to the US, and many of whom are refugees. So thank you. We'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Let me just stop the recording.